Welcome everyone to RUSI. Good morning. Great to be in this renewed library. I think it's really been much improved by the refurbishment. And delighted to welcome today Sir Malcom Rifkind, former Defence Secretary, former Foreign Secretary, most important of all, distinguished Fellow of RUSI. Sir Malcom is going to give us a presentation on Conservative policy, Conservative Party policy on defence. Thank you very much indeed for coming, Sir Malcom. I think whoever forms the next government faces a European security situation which is as dark or darker than it's ever been since the end of the Cold War. We've got the return of industrial war to Europe. We've got Putin brandishing the nuclear threat in ways that haven't happened since the Cold War. We've got a bitter conflict going on between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, with the possibility of the threat widening to Lebanon. We've got new challenges for the armed forces, technological challenges, the return to the essential task of territorial defence in Europe and support for Ukraine. The Conservative Party have pledged its return to defending 2.5% of GDP 2030 without any conditions. I mean, question mark, will that be enough in the state of the world that we have? No one better to address these issues than Sir Malcom. As you know, he's had a very distinguished career in defence and security. He was Defence Secretary from 1992 to 95. He was Foreign Secretary, my boss, from 1995 to 97. He remains very active in commenting on defence and security affairs, not least as a visiting professor at King's, where I've seen him in action. I know his passion for mentoring and debating with next generation national security professionals. Sir Malcom's talk and question and answer session that will follow will both be on the record. Could I just, you make the usual request that you put your phones onto silent. If there is an emergency of any kind, we need to exit the room, RUSI staff will tell us where to go. Sir Malcom, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very, very much, Peter, for that very delightful introduction. I spent a lot of my time working with distinguished ambassadors, and I think it's very appropriate an ambassador who's normally associated with foreign policy should be here this morning when we're primarily dealing with defence. I was told once that an ambassador is someone who could be disarming, especially when his country wasn't. Think that one through for yourselves. Now, I am here to speak not only about Conservative policy, I very largely approve of it, as you to know, but also some perhaps additional components that I personally would have liked to have seen, regardless of who the next government would be. I must start first with a health warning. I am not a spokesman of the Conservative Party. I am a Conservative member, and I shall vote Conservative. But I have the delightful pleasure of being not a minister, but a retired minister. I was once told a minister knows when he's retired. It's when you climb out of the back of your car and it doesn't go anywhere. And that is something which quite a number of my colleagues may experience in the near future and on the Labour side in probably the more long-term future. So put that on one side. But inevitably, if you're speaking about defence policy, you're also speaking about foreign policy. The two are properly and simply combined. One serves the other. And therefore, some of what I say will be about foreign policy, but in regard to the defence implications. And we start with a very interesting, in my view, paradox. Because one of the big defence issues of this election, and not just of this election, for quite some time, has been the level of our defence expenditure. Do we spend enough on defence, particularly on the armed forces? And the general view of many commentators, most commentators, we don't. And that it's getting more of a problem. The size of the army is very small in comparison to its historic size over the years. And in a number of other respects, an awful lot is wanting. Could we send in a full division in the situation of combat and so forth? I say it's a paradox because people perhaps have to be reminded, not I suspect this audience, but many people have to be reminded, that even today, Britain, no longer an empire, with only a population of 65 million and a world of 6 billion, has the fifth largest defense budget in the world. Apart from the United States, Russia, China, and more recently India, No other country in the world, of the 180 nations at the UN, spends more on defense than we do. France is pretty close, but is a little bit behind. So you'd think in that situation, the one issue that would not be terribly difficult to defend was the level of defense expenditure. So why do we? Because undoubtedly we have these massive problems. Whichever government comes to power will have to deal with them in one form or another. I think there's lots of reasons why you is it's not just a question of waste in the Ministry of Defense, as there is every government department from time to time. I think there are two particular factors that we should all bear in mind that don't justify it, but to some significant degree explain it. The first is that we are a nuclear weapon state. And the Trump nuclear system is an extremely expensive system, and it's going to be replaced by a new generation of nuclear submarines and missiles. And that takes a pretty healthy whack of the defense budget. It's a small percentage terms, but an awful lot of money and ongoing money. And that, of course, apart from the other nuclear weapons, is not a problem for the arms budget, the defense budget of other countries. So that's one reason. But the second reason is one I think we can take some pride in a way, although it's created big problems, that we've always taken the view that if our armed forces have to go into combat, it's not only desirable, but it is ethically justifiable and necessary, that not only should we aspire to win that conflict, to win that war, to win that combat, but we should also do so with the minimum injury or death to our armed forces, the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who will be responsible for fighting that war. And that means you want to have not just good equipment, good ships, good aircraft, good artillery, good tanks, but you want to at least try to have some of the best in the world, state of the art. And most countries in the world either couldn't possibly afford or don't choose to pay for state-of-the-art equipment. They have lots of soldiers, they're relatively cheap compared to the hardware, and they have sometimes second-hand equipment because it's all they can afford or they feel it justifies their requirement. We can't do it. We might have won the Falklands War. We'd applied that principle. The last war we fought just by ourselves. Now, state-of-the-art is not just something that makes it very expensive to order in the first place, but when you're having a new ship or a new aircraft or a new bit of artillery or whatever, it takes several years usually to complete and before it gets delivered. But during that time, the technology is continuing to advance. And so the defense companies, quite understandably and predictably, will come back and say, look, do you still want state-of-the-art? Because the art's moved on. And it's going to cost you another £1 billion, thank you much. And judges have to be made, well, we better do that, or crikey, we can't really afford to do that. Perhaps we'll have fewer aircraft rather than not so good ones. So I don't try and justify what's the challenge, but I think what I'm saying to at least some significant degree explains why with all these considerations, we still have this great problem. Now let's go to the immediate questions of the general election and what the parties have to offer to try to deal with that. And I'm not going to be partisan. I don't need to be. I can't be criticized for it. If I'm trying to give you a bipartisan view, or a non-partisan view, I think might be a better way of putting it, of what is on offer. First of all, as you know, I'm sure you will know, the government has said, the Conservative government has said, if returned, we will increase the defence budget to 2.5% of GP. It's roughly about 2.3% now. It's hovered around 2% for some time. And the Labour parties sound as if they said something similar. There is, however, a significant distinction. The Conservatives have chosen to commit themselves to doing that in the next Parliament. Means in the maximum of the next 4 or 5 years. The Labour Party have expressed an aspiration. I'm sure they're committed to it, but they have not committed themselves even with reservations to a particular timeline rather than as soon as we can. And obviously it opens up a gap as to whether it would be done within the specific time frame. If there is going to be increased defence expenditure, I should say, personally, I would hope to see reasons that I'll do, the share of the budget not being at 2.5%, but moving as soon as possible to 3% and maybe more. I mean, at the end of the Cold War, we were over 5% of our then GDP. Now, the GDP is much higher, but so is the cost of defence. So unless the international situation radically improves, we should at least have the objective of at least 3% of our GDP. Now, how should it be spent? My priority is to always ask, particularly our member of the NATO alliance, what actually is the main added value that the United Kingdom contributes to the alliance. Now, I maintain we contributed in regard to all the services, land, sea, air, and I'm sure we justifiably say that. But the real added value others cannot provide, or it's unrealistic to expect them to, is maritime, is naval. where France is the only other of the NATO European countries that has a really serious naval capability. And that remains very important if, God forbid, there are to be conflicts with the Russians, because although they have, by brilliant maneuvers on the part of the Ukrainians, effectively defeated the Russian Navy without there being a Ukraine Navy of significance in the Black Sea, so that the Russians have moved their operations to the Sea of Azov and so forth. So the Black Sea is unlikely to be a major problem, except for the Mediterranean countries, rather than ourselves. But for the rest of NATO, it's the Atlantic. And the Russians still not only have Baltic, which although largely surrounded now by NATO countries, they still have freedom of access to, but they also in the far north have Murmansk and their naval bases in the Arctic, which can quite easily get all their warships, and already do, in the Atlantic. So this is something which the UK has always had a prime interest in, and that suggests that our contribution in the circumstances of conflict, yes, we will have a land contribution, an army contribution of a significant kind, but it's our naval contribution. And there's a second consideration, and that is specific. Insofar as we are making a contribution to the rising tension between China and Taiwan and other Asian countries, the United Kingdom is not going to be sending an army. It will have relatively few aircraft to send, but we already have the frigates, the aircraft carrier, other ships can operate there. And we have a self-interest in doing so, not just a diplomatic or political interest. It surprised me to discover that something like 24% of our global seaborne trade goes to the Straits of Malacca and through the South China Sea. Not just to China, but also to Japan, South Korea, and other major trading places. So it's going to be maritime that has to be the prime way, but not the only way. I would want to see the army increased in size. I think 65,000 is too small. I would like to see it up to 100,000. And that is not dramatic in the sense of a military budget, because you're talking essentially about the salaries you pay and the living accommodation and the other things of that kind. Comparisons, sometimes I think comparisons are made with the smallest army since 1815, since Napoleon. As if, and that sounds terrible if it turns out to be correct. It possibly is correct. But wait a moment. First of all, in 1815, the army, as small as it is now, had to help look after what was then the British Empire, and that include India already, as well as many other territories. But secondly, 1815 was really the comparison with what we've experienced since the Cold War. You'd been at war 30, 40 years, and the Cold War was for about 40, 50 years. So inevitably, not just Britain, every country in the world, right, including Russia, dramatically reduced its defense budget. The question is not why is it down this far, but is now in international circumstance time to start putting it back up again. There is another area where there is some anxiety. Again, I'm trying to be as objective as the facts deserve, which is on the difference between the Conservative and the Labour Party on nuclear policy. Now, you'll have seen that Keir Starmer and colleagues announced what they call a nuclear weapons triple lock to try and sound credible because of the history of the Labour Party, that if they came to power, they would not only support nuclear deterrent, but ensure the new generation nuclear submarines built and do everything that a Conservative government would have done in similar circumstances. I think they probably mean that when they say it, but we cannot lose sight of two facts. The larger the Labour majority is, it's likely expectations to be very large, the more the left wing of the Labour Party will be represented and the more power they will have. And the bigger their majority, the more they will think they can get away with anything. It will not be about unity of the government. They will say this is an opportunity. So I think we must expect a resurgence of the left wing of the Labour Party, many of whom are still basically unilateralist in outlook. But there's an additional consideration. I'm not trying to be unkind, but it happens true that Keir Starmer was willing to fight the last election as part of a shadow cabinet led by Jeremy Corbyn. And if they didn't win the election, if they had won that election, we would have had a Corbyn prime ministership. And Corbyn not only remains a unilateralist, he actually made the most extraordinary stupid remark. I think it was in the campaign, or sometime round about then, because the official position of the Labour Party, even then, in order to keep their unity, was not to say they would get rid of nuclear weapons, but they had a sort of rather soft language. I can't remember exactly what it was. But Corbyn was asked, as Prime Minister, would you ever press the button? He said, no, I never would. Now, it's very easy to follow a policy based on deterrence, nuclear deterrence, when you're trying to deter a potential enemy, when your prime minister, who would have to make the decision, has already said, don't use them. That stopping deterrence becomes pure symbolism of a rather kind. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that's Starmer's position. What worries me more, because there was a time in his career when he was seen as more on the left of the Labour Party. I think he's much more centrist now. But if he had the inter-pressures of a kind he will have from the left of his own party, would he be as robust, not just in keeping nuclear weapons, but in the necessary speeches and statements that have to be made to maximize a deterrent value? Now, I just want to speak for another 5 or 10 minutes, so we have at least over half an hour for questions. But I want to say something about Ukraine and about China, and about a very small remark about the EU. Not because it's not important, it's just one I think relevant today. On Ukraine, there is, for all practical purposes, and it's something we can all be proud of, national unity in the support that is being given to Ukraine. All the political parties that I'm aware of overwhelmingly have supported the policy of maximum help for Ukraine. It might be individuals in each of the parties that take a different view, but that's not been the view of any of them, not just the Labour, but the Liberal Democrats, SNP, and others. But in addition to that, it also commands very wide public support. There's no votes to won or lost on that issue. So I'm confident that if there was a change of government, policy on the Ukraine would continue much as it is at the moment, and that is very, very important. Let me say something very briefly on Israel-Gaza, because there too has been a lot of all-party support for the principle of Israel having the right to defend itself, the atrocities that it experienced through Hamas, and the necessity to do something in Gaza to prevent that ever happening again. There we already have indications that a government would be different, albeit not in a fundamental way, to a conservative government. And that is on the issue of whether, as some governments have done in order to show empathy with the Palestinian cause, whether they should recognize that Palestine is a state. We all know Palestine isn't a state. I happen to not only believe it should be, I was the Foreign Secretary who actually committed the United Kingdom government back in 1996 to support for a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine, and I've changed from the view. But I've also changed from the view that you, as is the traditional British view, that you only recognize states that are states, that actually are independent countries that govern themselves and are able to do so in a meaningful way. And it is manifestly obvious that the whole issue at the moment is that Palestine isn't a state, isn't allowed to be one, and therefore recognize it as a state is, in my view, and in the view of the Conservative Party, is pure symbolism. It's pure rhetoric. It might make people feel good. It actually, if anything, does more harm than good because it distorts the use of language. Now, the Labour Party, to my surprise, because up to then they've been very much the same as the Prime Minister and his colleagues, have now said that, or have given a very broad hint that that is what they would do. They would recognize Palestine as a state. Why they do that? We all know the result of the local elections a few weeks ago, which showed that in a number of Labour seats, some of them are marginal seats, there is a significant Muslim minority, not 50%, but 20, 25% in the Midlands and Sheffield and one or two other places, and that the Labour vote slumped very substantially in its constituencies because it was believed from opinion polls and other sources because of what was seen as Labour giving inadequate support to the Palestinian point of view. So that is a real difference. I said there was something to say on EU, because the EU, of course, has no responsibility for defence policy or foreign policy in the real sense. But there was something reported, some of you may have seen the front page of the Financial Times today, where Rachel Reeves is quoted as saying that a Labour government would try to reopen the trade relations between Britain and the EU. And the Labour Party have said it's not that they're talking about trying to get back into the single customs area or part of the internal market, that they would want to reopen negotiations in a lot of individual areas to make it more appropriate. And if that meant following EU regulations, that would be a price worth paying in some specific areas. Now, I think that's dangerous territory. I think it's one that the Conservatives, as having emerged, will be exploited. It's relevant to defence because a lot of these issues affect the defence industry and the industrial support for our defence effort and cooperation, collaboration with European countries. I understand why Rachel Reeves is saying this, but the danger of what she's doing is this is a rather awkward issue. I remember when I was a Remainer, but when it happened, I assumed, well, at the very least, we'll stay in the single market. And when I began to look at Syria, I just realized that was not possible. Not just desirable, not possible. Because the two countries that are not EU members, which are on the single market, Norway and Switzerland, relatively small countries in comparison to Britain, France, or Germany, in order to participate in a single market, and this applies to individual directs, not just single market as a whole, have to incorporate into their own national law every EU directive relevant to the single market. Not just the existing ones, they have played no part in deciding. Any future ones, future changes the EU might decide. They will not require to consult or involve Norway and Switzerland. They just have to change their law if the EU so decides. Now that applies to the single market as a whole. But the point I'm making this morning is that even if the Labour Party were to restrict it to specific elements of our trading relationship and accept EU rules in order to benefit the British economy, what they will be doing, however unintentionally, is creating a rod for their own back, because it's not just the existing rules, as I'm saying. On something that they had accepted, the EU then changed that. They would not have to consult the UK, and the British Parliament would be told, you have no choice but to incorporate it in your law. And that was politically unacceptable. It's acceptable in Norway and Sweden, in Switzerland. Small countries, even if they were in the EU, you don't have a major impact on the content of laws. It's the big guys who decide most of that. For a country the size of the UK, that would be inconceivable. Right, final point I want to make, two short points I make. Looking to the future, and we're not just talking about the next 12 months or the next couple of years, there's a lot of worry about Trump and what that might mean defense and NATO defense. I don't believe in reality either will want to, and even if he wanted to, would be able to take the United States out of NATO. So we will remain a member of NATO under a Trump administration, in my view. What I don't know with somebody so volatile, so unexpected, who doesn't know his own policy, he only knows his instincts, is how he would interpret the support to be given if an Article 5 situation arose. Because Article 5 doesn't say you must go to war to defend a country. It says you must take all the appropriate measures required, and that required unanimity. And if he wanted to, he could create a major issue. The one that most worries me in the longer term is what he might do about the nuclear umbrella that NATO provides for Europe, which is why countries like Germany, but now Poland and all of Central Eastern Europe, as Italy and so forth, in various ways benefit from American nuclear weapons. And if, God forbid, a Trump administration was to say, well, we believe Europe has to defend itself more, it's got to, don't rely on us, even at level of the nuclear umbrella, that could, in a crisis situation, put Europe much more at the mercy of nuclear blackmail from Moscow, Putin or any successor of Putin. It doesn't have to use the nuclear weapons, just has to threaten them. If you have nuclear weapons and your adversaries don't, they're in trouble. However, Deus ex machina, it so happens that two countries, Britain and France, do have nuclear weapons. Far fewer. Britons are already committed to NATO. The French don't. Theirs could, and things that have been said suggest they might consider it. And what I'm really saying is that in a worst possible situation, it really falls to Britain and France, and they have to start that kind of dialogue, at least privately now, to how they could jointly make sure that the European countries of NATO could say to a hostile Russia and an indifferent Trump, yes, we only have 130 or so nuclear weapons in Britain, 140 or what it is in France, that's enough to destroy most of the western part of Russia, including Moscow, St. Petersburg, and forth, in the ghastly circumstances of nuclear conflict. So don't think that even without an American nuclear umbrella, Europe can be subject to blackmail. That's an important point. The other point that needs to be borne in mind is looking to the longer term, whether it's Trump or Biden, or whoever is the American president from whichever party. America is now going to face the possibility of two nuclear superpowers. Already has that. But circumstances could be actual military conflict. I'm going to put a scenario that I don't expect, and I think will never happen, but could happen, that at a time when the Ukraine war was still on, Xi Jinping decides the time has come to invade Taiwan, or to start that process, and the United States is then faced with how it's going to react. And of course it has to react, not just because it's committed to or it said it will, but because the United States is as much a Pacific power as an Atlantic power, unlike the United Kingdom. Came into the Second World War because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in the Pacific. So here's America faced with the possibility of having, if not all-out war, certainly military conflict and possible all-out war between two countries, Russia and China, simultaneously. And they might indeed be making it simultaneous in order to put it in that very difficult situation. So that is why I think whichever party wins the White House, not just this year, but over the years come, the pressure on Europe to do far more to defend itself, given that we are as wealthy collectively as the United States, and that in financial terms, there's no reason why we should be dependent on the United States in financial terms. That is something we must come to terms with. So when I'm talking about 3% and possibly even more, it's not just for the earlier reasons we've been discussing. It is because that may be the future, not because of some malevolent US president or a Trump-style White House, but even a president totally committed to NATO, but also committed to defending the United States' interest in the Pacific. That might involve massive relocation of their armed forces, at least for a period of time. So with these cheerful thoughts, I now conclude my opening comments and would welcome questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Malcolm, you're welcome. You will sit down if you want to. Well, Malcolm, thank you very much. That's a very, very comprehensive picture you've given us. We have half an hour for questions. Could I ask, when people ask questions, to identify themselves and on a microphone? Just before start, as Vice Chair of RUSI, I should say we are an entirely politically neutral organisation, and so we have also invited the Labour Party to come present a spokesman to present their view of defence policy, and if they do, we will obviously let you know of that as well. You referred to the Napoleonic Wars, which give us the historical context, not least, I think a certain battle was held on the 18th of June, tomorrow. So when I was ambassador in France, I tended to keep a very low profile for Waterloo Day. Luckily, it's also the day of Gaull's Pell from London, which is a much better terrain for the British ambassador in France. I'm going to abuse the chair's position just to ask you one thing, Malcolm.
Please.
You touched on the issue of defence procurement, but we've seen with the Ukraine war how war accelerates technological advance. For example, emergence of cheap drones, which have been pretty instrumental on the battlefield. Do you see areas where our own defence procurement effort needs to sharpen up and speed up to keep pace with that tempo of innovation in defence?
I'm not surprised, but I'm relieved that the government have already, the Ministry of Defence have already made major announcements on exactly that area, and not just in the last few weeks, I mean, at least over a year ago, and are giving very great priority to drone clicks. We saw in Azerbaijan, Armenia, how that's clearly reversed the power balance in that particular part of the world, but it also explains the extraordinary success of the Ukrainians in the Black Sea that I was referring to earlier, because it's been drones that have been, or something equivalent to drone, that have been so successful in seriously damaging the Russian Navy there. So yes, it is a big priority. I think the British government's already onto it. I can't say I'm an expert in the detail, but they certainly, by their public statements and by over the last 2 years, really, seem to be addressing that seriously.
Very good. Please, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sir Malcolm.
Could you just identify yourself?
Yes, indeed. Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum, but speaking here in a personal capacity. I would ask the question regardless of Rod Stewart's reception in Leipzig a few days ago, but I think that does say a lot. Mr. John Healey and others have pointed out the desire for a close security relationship, particularly have mentioned a bilateral relationship with Germany, which can be expanded. Frankly, is there a need to be very, very careful about Germany, given some of the internal things that are happening, the Russian sabotage, the considerable degrees of sympathy, and not least the bombshell revelations that are going to appear in a London court at the end of this year? How reliable could relationships with Germany in defence and security be? Thank you.
My short answer is they could be extremely reliable. Yes, you have properly drawn attention to some of the disagreeable things that have been happening on the margins of German politics. But they are the margins. At this moment in time, they might not always be the margins, because the AfD obviously is doing better than any of us are comfortable with. But so far as both the present German government and the main opposition, Friedrich Merz and the CDU, and the other centrist parties who dominate the Bundestag, are very much to be welcomed. So I don't have any problem about that. I think we've always got to be careful in defence policy, when central to our policy is membership of the NATO alliance, that it's not just about Britain. Any two countries that start getting chummy with each other, it sometimes sounds as if it's to the exclusion of others. So it should only happen when there are good defence reasons, which can be declared, why that makes sense. So, for example, Britain and Japan and Italy have come together as part of future aircraft production, and they've been quite open about it, exactly that it reduces costs and it helps to provide commonality. Now, I think one of the main objectives that should be for the next 5 to 10 years, yes, we have much wealth as America has, and yes, collectively, our armed forces expenditure is very high, but we don't have interoperability in any meaningful sense between the armed forces of the various NATO members, including the major ones, including Britain. And that is what would let us down in any serious conflict with Russia, that we would not have the full military capability that we would have if we all share the same equipment, the same military doctrine.
Very good. So, please.
John Wilson, a journalist and a member of RUSI and Chatham House and other military think tanks. You gave, as usual, a very erudite address, Sir Malcolm, but you're raising many points, which unfortunately I can't ask all today. So I must respect just to one, which is where you said the UK has the 5th largest budget in the world. I've looked at the defence budget of the Western and other nations, and I've spoken to people at the very highest level. The American defence budget appears to be dwarf everybody else, but when questioned, it pointed out to me that half it represents wages and salaries. Some years ago at a lecture by Fu Ying, she said that there was a disparity in living standards of 20 to 1 between China and the US. Therefore, are we not kidding ourselves, if I could put it like that the Western defence budgets do not compare favourably with those of Russia and China, because their living standards are cheaper and therefore basically getting a much big bang for them?
Okay, I get the question. It's all firepower, ultimately. And America was once described as not being just a superpower. America, compared to any other country in the world, including Russia and China, is a super-duper power, and the only one there is. And it's not just the size of the budget, it is their capability of sending large numbers of armed forces, ships, aircraft, infantry, to any part of the world, in several parts of the world at the same time, for what are relatively containable conflicts. Now, there's no other country that comes anywhere really near that, as likely to, including China, in the foreseeable future. So the US remains crucial, but the Americans will have their own priorities. And the only problem that I've spoken about this morning is what happens if they have to fight not 2 conflicts, but 2 one Europe. That's when I think Europe might find it was expected to do more by itself.
Thank you.
More, not everything.
Sir Malcolm, good morning. Rupert Jones, ex-British Army, and in this guise, IBM Defence Advisor. You talked about the challenges UK's got getting sufficient capability out of what a large defence budget. And you also talked about, quite rightly, we need to focus on where NATO really needs UK capability. I would just make one observation about that, and then my question. The observation would be, we've got to give leadership, NATO leadership, and requires us to have balanced force. Of course, what that means is there'll continue to be pressure on the defence budget. 2.5%, 3%, there will be pressure. So my question is, how can the UK get more out of its defence budget? And of course, there's focus on the procurement system, which the current government is doing. But what more can we do to get what we need out of this defence budget? Thank you.
Well, I take your question, and I think what we must avoid doing is saying it's a choice between either spending more on defence or it's getting more out of the existing budget. Because it has to be both. In an ideal world, we should be spending 3.5% at the moment. But that's not just our problem. That's the French problem, that's the German problem, and virtually every other country has that challenge. I mean, we've seen what Russians are doing. I mean, they now are spending, what is it, like 11% of their, 11% now, of their GDP on defense. Now, that's because they're at war. The Ukrainians are doing something similar. But that totally distorts their domestic economy. Mm-hmm. It makes them, it sounds good on GDP basis or some of the national statistics, which don't distinguish as to how you're spending public funds. But when you think about it, the Russian economy is going to be starved of and its health services and social services and everything else as long as this war lasts. So I can't give you, in the time available, any more detailed answer than that. You're right, there has to be ways in which you can get better returns. If I can just be allowed one example. When I was Defence Secretary, I was forced by the Cabinet to find 750 million. It doesn't sound very much now, but it was more in the 1990s. 750 million out of the defence budget after we'd already had a lot of cuts. And I offered the Treasury, to the initial concern of the Chiefs of Staff, I said, instead of 750 million, we can do a deal that's $1 billion. And they all looked at me as if I was crazy, particularly the Chiefs of Staff. And I said, but there's a condition. That is, if we manage to find, without reducing fighting capability, $1 billion of savings, we keep the extra 250 million and can spend it without going to you, the Treasury, on whatever fighting capability is required. And that was how we were able to order for the first time cruise missiles, for example. We reversed certain regiment cuts. It was called Line First. It wasn't perfect, with some mistakes, but it got the confidence and support, not just of the Chiefs of Staff, but of the armed forces themselves, because they were getting something out of it.
If I may, I think that your vignette absolutely points the future. There is something about allowing defence to not be fixed by Cabinet Office approval. We've got to move at the speed of war, not at the speed of Whitehall.
Yep. Oh, speaking as a former National Security Advisor, I think that's a very controversial remark. Very, very fleet of foot. I thought you were going to say that you offered up arrows, which is usually the first example given. Please.
Hello, my name is Oh Ryung-jin, and I'm studying at SOAS, and I'm from Korea, the country who was saved by British Army and United Nations Army during our civil war. So I would like to ask a kind about R2P, because now the trendy of this supernation decision-making about security is more G7, Five Eyes, AUKUS, and supernation decision-making, like the Japanese appealing their role in Pacific Ocean. So instead of bilateral tension, but do you really think that the UN R2P or as arbitral army, peacekeeping mission can come back? Like, that now this authority of UN and the international community is much weakened because of Russia-Ukraine war and Palestine war. So I would like to ask you about the trendy and what you can expect.
By RTP, I'm assuming you're meaning responsibility to protect, the sort of obligation on the international community, some either atrocities or some invasion or some major event is taking place. We all have a responsibility, even if we don't have treaties with the country concerned, to intervene. There's nothing ethically wrong with that. It makes a lot of ethical sense, but you get into enormous problems. You try to translate that into an obligation to militarily intervene. Because if there's one thing we've learned from the last 30 years, it is not just that going in is more difficult than coming out. It is that, yes, you can get rid of a despot. The American-led invasion got rid of Saddam Hussein. It then created a political vacuum, and they couldn't contain that. And that has happened in Afghanistan, it's happened elsewhere, where that intervention has taken place. So speaking personally, I'm very skeptical about that sort of intervention. Now, the reality is if a country intervenes militarily and overthrows a government, however beastly that government is, you can only be sure of long-term success if you're going to stay around and people in that country know you're going to be around for a long time. And that's happened with the British Empire. As the empire grew, when we took over by force a particular part of Africa or Asia, for various reasons, the local people knew that we were powerful enough to stay there for the indefinite future. And so a country like India gradually decided, on its own initiative, to adopt our sort of legal principles, the rule of law, various other things that distinguishes India from a number of other countries, and which look to continuing. So, but you need not permanence, it can never be permanent, but you need to be known to be around, and that's not realistic in the modern world. That can't happen in the modern world in the way that it happened in the 19th century.
Thank you. Please.
Dominic Carratu of RUSI, Chatham House, and whatever. Thank you very much for your tour de force. Very realistic, very pragmatic. I think you're right to focus on the maritime, the nuclear capabilities we bring. A couple of nuances on that. You mentioned about Pacific, Atlantic. Do we really have capability to expand into the Pacific? Really? I mean, the one aircraft carrier we sent.
Let me respond, if I may. Is that your question?
Well, and a second unrelated question. Zelensky mentioned 2 years back that World War III begun. Do you think actually he's right when we look back?
On your first point, no, we don't have the capability to make a comparable contribution to the Pacific as we should in the Atlantic. And if you ever have to make a forced choice, the Atlantic as our home ground has to be given priority. So if you're saying, are we likely in a time of conflict in Taiwan or something similar to send the army, with very few exceptions, we might send a special regiment or something of that kind, but we're not going to send a land army. It's likely we'll have a major contribution to make, but maritime is different. It's not different just for symbolic reasons. It's different because we actually do have an interest in freedom of passage through the South China Sea. The sea lanes are international. I mentioned earlier, part of our own trade, never mind the world's trade, goes through these areas. So China must be persuaded by all means that it must not militarize in a way that actually interfered with that freedom of passage. And the best way to show how much importance we attach to it is to be prepared to send our own navy to be part of any attempts to deal with that. On your second question, Zelensky's remark about World War III has begun. And I heard last week, I was at a briefing by I'm not going to mention his name because I disagree with him vehemently, and he admitted he misled the audience. He talked about the war has begun. He actually used, this is a very distinguished academic guy who knows the stuff very, very well. He said the war has begun. Talk about there might be war because of cyber, because of attempts by Russians to do it, and it's rubbish. And he actually admitted, he said, yeah, I shouldn't have used that phrase, but sometimes you have to use strong language to get people to listen, which I don't think is an impressive explanation. What do I say war has not begun? Look, the easy thing is to compare where we are now with where we were in 1937-39. And that did lead to a world war. And where we are now is infinitely better to where the free wars in the late 1930s. Infinitely better. Just look at what happened. When Hitler invaded Poland, Poland fought marvelously, but 3 weeks later it was occupied. And then he turned his attention to the rest of Europe. After 2 years, Russia had failed to do more than get 11% or 12% of the Ukraine, plus Crimea that it already had. We're in totally different territory. But there's another fundamental difference, and this goes back not 1939, it goes to the end of the Cold War. If war had gone out any time during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was already in Germany. It was already in Berlin. It was already in all the countries of Eastern and Central Europe. It would have started the conventional part of the conflict right in the middle of Europe. Now it is, 1,000 miles east. The conflicts that Russia is contemplating, equally unacceptable, are conflicts in what used to be parts of the old Soviet Union. And who would imagine? I wouldn't have imagined. I was a minister of state in the Foreign Office at the time of Gorbachev's visit to Mrs. Thatcher. And the idea that Russia would be going to war with Ukraine or might interfere in Georgia or Moldova. We know that Putin believes the of the Soviet Union, by which he means the Russian Empire, was the worst thing that ever happened. It's nothing to do with communism. It's to do with empire. And that doesn't mean there isn't a threat to the rest of Europe. The Baltic states in particular would be potentially vulnerable. And thank God, Putin's stupidity has led to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, which means that if the Baltic states were invaded by the Russian army, up till now, we were always worried how long it would take to get reinforcements, land reinforcements from Poland through Skalki Gap into Lithuania. Now they can be taken in 2 or 3 hours by air, by sea, from Gotland, Sweden, Finland, right into the Baltic. Putin's done his best to protect the Baltic states, even if he didn't quite intend to.
He's made NATO larger, stronger, more united, and the northern flank more coherent than it's ever been.
In every respect.
2 or 3 more questions, please.
I'm Desmond Bowen. I'm associated with IISS. Your focus, Sir Malcolm, on defence policy and defence and very much gave a push to maritime expansion. I'd like to broaden the subject to security and say a word which I didn't think passed your lips, and that's resilience. Resilience at home. And much we have to be investing in that, whether it's to counter missiles, whether it's cyber, whatever. But is that something that you think is defence? It probably goes beyond defence, and how much should be invested in improving our resilience at home?
Yeah, I mean, for 5 years during David Cameron's time, I chaired Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. Note, not just Intelligence, Security Committee. And you're quite right, resilience is crucially important, and it's something which GCHQ in particular has been involved with for a good number of years now, because one of the things that's not so widely known, and it's a secret, but it's just not widely known, GCHQ spends a lot of time advising individual companies or public bodies or utilities who might suffer a cyber attack, how to deal with that. And one of the reasons why the Ukrainians were far more successful than anybody ever expected them, there was a lot of fear that in the first few weeks of a Russian invasion, the Russians would use cyber attacks to essentially stop the Ukraine functioning as a modern state, therefore make it so much more vulnerable. They'd succeeded. They didn't know a remedy. They still haven't succeeded in that. And it's to the credit of the United Kingdom and the United States that we spent for several years after Crimea, and it continues to this day, giving advice and technical support, technical help to Ukrainians as to how they could protect, not perfectly, obviously, you can never do that perfectly, but this kind of resilience that your question implies. So I think it's been a high priority. Is it perfect? No, it's perfect, because the enemy is always improving their cyber attacks. You have to improve your resilience proposals. But as countries go, Britain is certainly in the lead, not necessarily the leader, but one of the leading countries responding to that dimension.
Thank you.
Hello, Tom McCain, associated with the Institute. I wonder if I could ask you, Sir Malcolm, to say a little bit more about your thoughts on how to get the European allies to deliver a bigger bang for their buck. I mean, you've hinted at it a bit. You said that it would be a good thing if they would use more common platforms so that they were more interoperable. But what's your thinking on how one would go about achieving that?
Well, it is an uncomfortable truth that before Mr. Trump used such disagreeable language, the number of NATO countries that met the percent target, I can't remember the exact numbers, there were something 7 or 8, there's now about 20, 21, 22, right. Something like that. I don't, 18 now. Is it 18? But it's going up as we speak. Going up. It's expected to be about 21 or something like that. Now, it was slowly happening anyway. It would have happened before the American president was, because the American public opinion, Democrat as well as Republican, believes the Europeans have been getting away with defense on the cheap. And what's more, they're right, if the truth be told. Now, the key country is, of course, Germany. Germany did, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, totally revolutionize their rhetoric and their policy and their objectives, quite slow to implement it. That's partly for German cultural reasons. These things are cultural as well as practical or financial. But the German government, at least, is very committed now to the percent target, is constantly doing quite a lot to try and improve its military contribution. I'm not an expert enough on the detail of what it's doing, and it probably isn't enough, but I'm more that the Ukraine continues. And if American policy ceases to be as able to be taken for granted, that it will provide whatever is required, Germany and Poland, of course, already is doing remarkably well. There's one other dimension worth remembering, that if this horrible war ends with Ukraine, however it ends, Europe will have a new major military armed country, which will be on the same side as NATO in any conflict against Russia. Ukraine is now going to have an army. It won't be as large as it is now if there's peace, but it's still going to never reduce its commitment to strong defense because of its own existential requirements. So Ukraine will have to be included alongside Poland as two major European countries, which in both the short term and the long term will, whether Ukraine's in NATO or not, be part of Europe's defense ability.
Most battle-hardened answers on the planet, isn't it?
At the moment in time.
And they are pro-Western, and we'll see at the NATO summit what exactly they get. They won't get a full invitation, I think, but the alignment between Ukraine and NATO is now there permanently, I think. One question, gentleman there.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. A quick one, and then one last question. So please, perhaps we can take two questions together.
Pate Toms, member of RUSI and chairman of the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. Follow up to your excellent points on the U.S. nuclear deterrence umbrella possibly being under Trump. Should the UK and France consider increasing their production of nuclear weapons and consider basing some of those weapons in Poland and the Baltics?
Okay,
Can I just very
no,
shortly
okay,
deal
yeah,
with
no,
that?
go ahead.
It helps to fix better.
No, of course.
The short answer is I don't think so. We don't, of course, our nuclear weapons are purely submarine launched. We don't have or aspire to have either tactical nuclear weapons or air launched or ground launched nuclear weapons. So I think we meet our requirement. They can already devastate the territory of any enemy. And I think we have to bear in mind we don't want a nuclear weapons race. Just for the sake of having it. So that would be my own view.
Very good point. Thank you. Last question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. This lecture was very informative and very give us very insightful thinkings. So I'm Cindy. I'm a visiting scholar at SOAS. I'm studying outer space policy actually. So I think given that defense technology often has a dual use application, so it naturally exerts a substantial influence on defense policy in the UK too. Especially Ukraine and Russia war, we could see the kind of power of outer space policy. So in particular, areas such as cybersecurity, space situational awareness, and the protection of space assets are very important, I think. The history of the United Kingdom space policy highlight these things, differences in the...
Could you come to your question, please?
Yeah, taken by the Conservative and Labour parties. So from the perspective of the Conservative Party, in which direction should the UK space policy evolve? Moreover, I think concerning space policy, what potential avenues for cooperation might exist with the United States and the EU?
Sure. The short answer to that important question, yes. I mean, put the fault on one side. Our whole defense requirement essentially for the foreseeable future is based on our alliance, not just with NATO, but our increasing close cooperation with India, with Japan, and other countries that have not total agreement with us on foreign policy, but have areas of concern that coincide with us. India, for example, has exactly the same anxieties over China, as does Vietnam, of all countries. There's also scope for bilateral cooperation. Nothing was done that would weaken the NATO commitment. That is the single most important and permanent part of our own national security, as well as global, it's in the interest of the wider international global community.
Well, Samal, thank you very much indeed. You've taken on a very wide-ranging journey across a lot of very complex issues at a difficult, volatile, unpredictable time. Thank you for your conservative view of defense policy. Please keep an eye on our website for upcoming events here on defense and security. I think we will perhaps thank Sir Malcolm in the traditional way. Thank you so much.